I'm shaking like a leaf. I'm so nervous. I had not been with many men in my personal life, so this was like a huge jump for me. And he pulled me aside and he's like,
some individuals, they're using sex as a form of coping, and that's acceptable and that's appropriate.
Is that because I hear some people are like, you need a coping mechanism? There's something wrong and broken with you.
Anything that's deemed to be an addiction, you want to ask, what's the deeper wound?
What would you say to someone that says porn ruins more marriages and families than help?
To deal with the anxiety that can come up when your partner says, I also enjoy body shapes and sizes that aren't yours, which can be very threatening to someone who's toxically monogamous.
When I started to see couples that were in porn, like legacy porn stars, and they were in these deep committed relationships, and that was shocking to me.
But some people see relationality as I own you and your body, even when it doesn't involve someone else. And I can be upset if you're masturbating. I can be upset at what you're looking at, and that's problematic.
I think it's abusive. Chris, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks
I'm really
for
excited for this. You pulled through an amazing 5 hours on day one, so kudos. You obviously know your stuff to be able to go for that long. I'm
really
have
excited. To thank caffeine.
Yeah.
It's like what gives me the motivation to go. And I think it's always about the crowd as well. People, it's such a diverse sect of people that are in the audience, and the questions and the energy kind of moves me. So anyway, but thank you for being here as well.
Yeah, of course. I'm like, where do we start? And I guess let's start on the fringes with you. What does sex outside the lines look like? What does existing on the fringes of whether it's society, sexuality, identity, what does that look like?
I love the question. I clinically really got my start in the work around sexuality within the sex addiction world. And I kind of talked about this yesterday a little bit. A lot of the things that we were being trained to use to diagnose a sex addiction in someone were things that myself and other really healthy individuals were doing. So I started to notice that we very much pathologize what's on the fringe. And that's where I actually believe a lot of mental health and authenticity lives. I think conformity is not a sign of health. Most people move through the world either doing what we're supposed to do or what everyone else is doing, authoritarianism or conformism. And I think authenticity is really a good guide for mental health. And so when I wrote my first book, Sex Outside the Lines, I really wanted to kind of honor that. I wanted content and form to align. I wanted the name, I wanted the languaging, I wanted the concepts. And individuals that I work with clinically are those that feel on the fringes. And because of that, really don't feel as though they fit in or they can be seen as mentally healthy. And so one of the activistic missions in my work is to really normalize diverse creative ways of being.
Mm-hmm. So when you have someone, and you have like this large cultural narrative that there is sex addiction and there is porn addiction, yes. What are your opinions on that? Because I don't think that's what it is. I think it's more of a compulsion issue or some kind of avoidance, like a means of avoidance. What's your take on this?
I think that's very much what it is. Mm-hmm. There's some individuals that I think what they deem to be a sex addiction is shame around what they're turned on by. Mm-hmm. And so all they really need is psychoeducation and to have it normalized that what you're interested in is quite okay. And a wealth of people also might seek that out. I try to, in my work and in some of my presentations, use stats from porn search engines to show people that the majority of what people are looking for is very colorful, diverse stuff. Mm-hmm. And that can be very normalizing. Other individuals, it's about their rate of use, and some people have a higher sex drive, some people have more free time. Some individuals, they're using sex as a form of coping, and that's acceptable and that's appropriate.
Is that because I hear some people are like, you need a coping mechanism? There's something wrong and broken with you.
Yeah, there's this idea culturally that we should always be able to turn to ourselves, and I think that that would be phenomenal, but often life will throw something at us that is far bigger than what we have the internal resources to deal with. And I like the idea of us turning to people, co-regulation, and using relationships and friends and family members and partners to kind of process and to hold us and to get us through. And I also think sometimes we need to use things like jogging, reading, meditation, sexuality as a way to soothe our nervous system and to kind of bring us back down. And I think that there's got to be an acceptability in that. But as you know, sex is always a special case. You could fill in the blank with any form of soothing, and people probably find a way to make that make sense. shopping, exercising, food, even at times, although that's a punchy one.
Yeah.
But sex, they're like, hold on a minute. You know what I mean? That can't be okay. And I also saw that a lot of sex workers or individuals that were using sex workers, that inherently was seen often as a sex addiction, that there could be no other way to conceptualize that career or that use. And I think that's a really important part of the sex addiction, challenge. But compulsivity exists for sure. There are people that food, exercise, shopping can just feel a little out of control to them. And so there can be some really beautiful healing work in looking at what it is they're seeking in those activities, and are there other healthier, maybe more sustainable ways to get those needs met.
And is there an element or any kind of correlation between narcissism, like actual narcissism, and sex addiction, like quote sex addiction?
Yeah. Narcissism's a funny word, right? Because we sling that around.
It's
culturally.
overused so much, yeah.
If you do something I'm upset by, you're a narcissist.
No, I mean in the diagnosable way, like someone who's actually diagnosed.
Thank you for saying it like that. Because I think we really kind of sling it around.
Like, you're a jerk, you must be a narcissist. Like, no, we all have a little bit of that. If you take that dark triad, everyone's going to have a percentage in all of that. It doesn't mean you're broken, doesn't mean you're bad.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, it's very normal, but to actually be diagnosed, that is a totally different animal.
Yes, completely clinical.
Yes.
And is there a connection to that in sex addiction? Oh, I'm sorry. Ask your question again.
So do you see a correlation between the actual narcissist, diagnosed narcissist, and sex addiction? Because I've had friends that were with someone that was a claimed sex addict, and what I see is just narcissistic behavior. There's so many steps that are required to hire somebody, and that was this person's modality. So he was just using professionals constantly all the time. I'm like, that's a lot of work, that's a lot of money, and he just seems to not give a shit about your feelings. There just seems to be like zero empathy. So for me, I see just more narcissistic behavior and not this other thing.
Because the question could be, why is this individual unable or unwilling to seek out sexuality in some form that doesn't require them to have control via payment or service provided? What is the inner, deeper work? And that's why I love using sex therapeutically, because I think that question is what brings us into the deeper pieces. What is that? Why is that person engaging in that process? And is there a diagnosis that is getting unaddressed when we just focus on maybe being sex addiction? Is that person do they have intimacy phobia? Again, do they need to be in control because vulnerability is something that's scary to them? How then does that play out outside of sex? How good of a friend could they be? How good of a boss could they be if they're not able to be intimate, to be vulnerable, to honor other forms of relationality? Because you're right, sex worker use could sometimes be sociopathy, it could be narcissism, it could be a host of things. And so that question is powerful. And
I think what's like the most important thing, and kind of why I'm tying that in, is what frustrates me about this misuse of the terms porn addiction and sex addiction. It's not me saying that people don't have problems with these things. They absolutely do. I would be lying if I was pretending that that's not a thing, or there's not some kind of population that does suffer from this. But you're actually doing those people such a disservice if you're saying that it's one thing when it's really this other thing that needs to be healed and addressed. Because if you're saying, oh, well, it's as simple as just not watching the porn, I feel like, and you can speak to this because you're the professional in the room, but if you just simply say it's just a sex problem and you get rid of the sex, or it's just a porn problem, you get rid of the porn, it's going to mutate into something else.
That's right. That's beautifully said. And that's a great actually soundbite for some of the work I try to do, which is anything that's deemed to be an addiction, you want to ask, what's the deeper wound, right, that is getting played out? What is the deeper wound within which they're turning to shopping over use of exercise or sexuality? And you're correct. If we don't go deeper and figure out what they are turning to those things as a way to heal or avoid, it will get placed onto another process. And that's what you'll see happen, unfortunately, in drug and alcohol recovery and quote unquote sex addiction recovery. They are maybe abstinent from drugs and alcohol. They're maybe no longer engaging in that problematic sex, but it gets transferred onto food or shopping or gambling or something else. And this person feels healthy because they're no longer using drugs and alcohol or sex problematically, but it's just now pushed onto something else. So
if you have somebody that is spending, let's say, 8 hours a day watching pornography, they're avoiding their family or their spouse, their responsibilities, where, like, I guess, what are actionable steps for this person to try to live in a healthier way? Yeah,
I love that question. I turn to the word mindfulness, asking yourself, in the moment where I feel compelled to turn to whatever this thing is for me, and in this example, sex, what need are you trying to get met? And then the second question is there another way in which you can get that need met that might have no longer term negative consequences or problems tied to it. So I'll tell clients when they're working on more mindful porn use or masturbation, before you turn to it, say to yourself, am I horny? Am I bored? Am I lonely? If you're horny, great. That's a healthy use of that. It's a sexual outlet. If you're bored, maybe try to find some other way to engage yourself and stimulate yourself. Not because it's wrong to sometimes use sex or porn, but I want people to have a full range of coping mechanisms, right? That fluidity, that flexibility, that's a sign of health. Biologically, neurologically, sexually, options, choices. If you only have one thing to turn to, you don't have choice. That's rigidity. That's not health.
And super fragile, yeah.
100%. So ask yourself, like, what is this moment about? What got triggered? What am I turning to this to do? And like I said, if it's horniness, great. Just like if you're hungry, turn to food. But if you're bored or you're lonely or something else, find another way to maybe meet that need.
I entirely agree. I don't know how this came into my mind, but the topic of incels. So the topic, I know it popped,
right,
it popped in. So I'm like, I
Wow.
gotta take it. So there's this idea that there's always been a population of usually younger men that weren't able to partner up for some reason. They don't have a sexual outlet. And without that sexual outlet, they became very destructive. So what a lot of these countries would do, this is back in the day, is they would send them to war. So a lot of these Vikings, it's suggested, weren't like these big, sexy guys that had everything that they wanted. They were actually the problematic men that weren't being able to partner up. So they would actually channel that sexual energy and rage in a useful way, which was war and conquering. So now we have this group of men that still exists, and it's like, what do you do with them? And you see them online. It's very, at least in my space, they are
I'm
online.
sure you do.
It's unavoidable.
And I'm sorry you do.
And what's so funny and what I find to be such a, like, just an oxymoron is a lot of people blame porn for them. So we're pretending that they didn't exist before. So we're saying the reason that they're not able to couple up or have sexual access is because they're spending too much time on porn. But then if they don't have access, like a sexual outlet, that they become more violent. So then it's like, if you take away the porn, isn't that going to be more of a problem? So have you seen a connection between involuntary celibacy and porn consumption, or do you think that that group has kind of always existed?
So before I answer that, let me go back to the connection between what you just posed and what we just talked about, because I think it's, again, not looking at the real wound, right? And blaming the manifestation or the form of coping for that wound, right? It's not that porn causes the problem. It's that people who have certain problems turn to porn. And this group specifically, who doesn't have the access they think they deserve to females or specific females, then turn to porn because that's where they do, right? So it's like, you can't blame where they go for solution as having created the problem. That's their attempt to solve that problem. But pose your question to me again. The forced celibacy.
Yeah. So incel is involuntary celibacy, right? So
right.
it tends to be this group of men that just don't have access to women
Which
for some
is
reason.
a question itself in there. Involuntary celibacy, I would want someone to ask themselves, why is that? Why have I been unable to find connection and sexuality out in the world? And it isn't because of women. And I want people to do that internal work. Which this group does blame women. Of course. Yeah. Right? And I want them to do the internal work of, why am I unable to make meaningful connections that can lead to sexuality? Right? Because I think that's where mental health comes in. I think mental health is relational health. And I think it's in our relationships and our relational struggles that we really see where our work is. Right? What a beautiful mirror. Yeah. Every time someone upsets us or triggers us or there's an issue in our relationship, look at yourself.
Loved that part of your talk. So you were like, if you feel triggered.
People hate this.
If you feel triggered, it is not on the person that triggered
That's
you.
right.
It is for your job to go inside and say, hey, why am I being triggered? And you do the work. It's not my job to not trigger you. It's your job not to be triggered.
The
I was
problem's
like,
not the
finally
trigger.
someone saying that.
Yeah, and I think this topic really very much aligns with that. Go inside and ask yourself, why was that specifically disruptive to me before I point the finger at that which disrupted me? Because ideally, you learn to be less triggerable. We can't live in a world where we're trying to remove every trigger. There's going to be sharp objects that you're going to bump into. And healthy people go inside first. And so whenever I talk about sexuality publicly, I pose that because I know it's going to throw a lot of people off, because I say some things that are a little innovative, punchy, because I want people to really think, and I really want people to walk away transformed from my work. And so with the audience being so vast, there's going to be some triggers for people, and I want them to turn inside, and I want them, people that are involuntarily forced into celibacy to also ask themselves, how has that come to be? And are there other areas in my life that might align with some of this?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think once someone gets stuck in this blame victim loophole, it's very hard to get out of. And that energy is palpable. So if you have someone that is just so angry and blames everyone else for their situation, like you can feel that. And then it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy at that point.
And then when you surround yourself with others in the same situation, you amplify and you feed it. And that is even more dangerous and destructive.
Right. So if you find yourself in that community, I would say exit very quickly.
That's right. That's right.
Exit very quickly. I want to make sure that I word this properly. Oh, this one was interesting where you were talking about that we have sex to our level of development, and I loved that.
That's another really powerful statement.
Yeah, I've never heard that.
What did that mean for you when you heard it? What came up for you?
For me, it went right to vulnerability and intimacy. And I guess this ties into the other thing that we were talking about earlier before we started recording, which is the sexual styles. So I don't know if this is how you intended it to come across, but this is how I took it. When you got into sensational focus, to me, that's entry. For me, that was entry level. So I can feel things and I can enjoy pleasure, but I can't look at you, and I can't have you really looking at me. So eyes are closed, and it's just this exchange. Then you go into relational intimacy, and that's eyes open, partner oriented. Like, are you enjoying this? Are you enjoying me? And it's more of this.
Developmental.
It's like this collective embodiment. Like we're now dancing together, and it's a different level of intimacy. And then you got into role play or kink, and I was like, well, I'm not all the way there. Sometimes I can get in the place I might need like a drink to get there and really shed some of that like insecurity. So for me, it was almost an elevation, a hierarchy of development of vulnerability and intimacy.
Beautiful structural analysis, because that is in fact very accurate and a beautiful model for someone to, as you just did, self-assess where they are and what could be meaningful, because it's never to imply that there's anything wrong with monogamy or more, what we'd call vanilla or basic sex. There's no hierarchy in all of that. But I do think there's something interesting in that question of what would it require. But to go back to the core statement of we have sex up to our current level of development, I'm going to be talking a lot about that actually tomorrow. That's like the core of tomorrow's talk, sexual bypassing.
Amazing.
And just to kind of keep this dialogue moving, it's this whole idea that, believe it or not, how people currently define their sexuality most likely probably isn't. What they're actually saying is that which I'm doing is within my level of current comfort. And to push on those boundaries makes me too anxious. And so I'm going to stay safe. That's not inherently bad or wrong, but it's when people really reify or make absolute an identity as though they aren't anything and there's no room to move beyond that, right? And people do that with sexual identity, and even in the sex world, they'll say things like, I'm a sub, I'm a dom, I'm a top, I'm a bottom. No, you are most comfortable in those positions and in those roles. That doesn't mean you have to do work to expand beyond them, but let's just recognize that.
Yes.
You fused with those. That's your safe space. But there is a world in which, if you wanted to do that developmental work, you could find your way into another role.
I love that so much. And I also like that you kind of, it's like you're tossing out identity. And
Yes, thank you for hearing that. That's exactly what I'm trying to do. But that's a punchy statement to say to people. I'm throwing out identity.
It's so necessary because everything is always an overcorrection. It's this pendulum, right? I don't like this, overcorrect. Oh, I don't like that, overcorrect. Yes. And then you need someone to kind of just like shatter the model and say neither of these things is right. So we had this place where, and I feel like most of it's gone, but like you couldn't be gay. Like that was like even in my lifetime, you couldn't be gay. Gay marriage is still really new. I feel like that is so massively accepted. I think most Americans now support gay marriage and gay rights. But because of how restrictive everything was in the past 80s, 90s, 2000s, now everything has to be an identity. And to me, what pisses me off is like, well, you're not that thing. That's right. And you're putting yourself in such a box. And then also it seems like a play of significance as well, because when you get into a place where if you can make it more niche and more niche and more niche, it's like, well, now that's where I'm garnishing my significance and my uniqueness, instead of actually just being your unique self, which is probably more scary and more challenging. So if you say, I'm not any of these things, I'm a whole person and I change minute to minute. And there's this, I think it's an Alan Watts quote, and he has I have no obligation to be who I was 5 minutes ago. And
for me, and it sounds like for you as well, what a beautiful sentiment, what a beautiful honest rule, because to foreclose the possibility of something other than, or to always be becoming is I think a lack of mental health. I think we have to get rid of identity. It's confining. People overly buy into it. They see it as absolute. They see it as I guess reified, these higher natural, and I want people to get rid of identity, and I want them to challenge themselves to step outside.
Yeah, I love that so much, and I don't think enough people are doing that, because again, I think it's coming from a good place. Everyone wants to like honor everyone's experience and all of that, but I see it as like people are just taking their legs out from themselves.
And that's why I use the word sexual bypassing. I want to get that into the world more, because there's books on the concept spiritual bypassing, which is when you use spiritual concepts to avoid actually doing the work, right? Oh, well, I'm meditating, right? But you're still a jerk out in the world. So clearly there's a lack of application, and people do that, as we just kind of talked about briefly, sexually.
Yeah, it's instead of feeling the thing and allowing that natural process, well, I see oneness, so it's all okay. And it's like, you're skipping a lot of steps in between.
That's right.
And we
do that in a lot of areas of our life to our detriment.
So I guess the levels of vulnerability and being able to get to a place where you are open and receptive and curious, and you want to expand where your current state of development is, how does one do that?
Yeah, first you got to be brave.
Yeah.
Because, you're pushing outside of what you've known and how others know you. And to shift your own identity is to shift your location in the world for some people. And I said this, and it feels very vulnerable to say this, and I'll say this with you. I feel very safe with you.
Thank you.
I've lived in many different sexual worlds and different sexual identities, and none of them ever felt truly like home because of what we just talked about. There's an echo chamber and there's boundaries. So when I was part of the hetero community, I never felt like I fit in, and no one ever talked about pushing on those boundaries. When I spent time maybe in the gay community, it was very much the same thing. I didn't see myself there. I didn't relate to the values and the norms, and no one challenged me to engage or explore sexuality with women. And it's that confinement. So there's got to be some bravery and courage to step outside of an identity, because then you have to self-define, and we don't like that. We like everything to be clear and defined, and it's going to change your relationship to other people in the world, maybe your primary partner and family members. But back to your question, like, where's the work really begin? I think it's first on acknowledging that who I see myself to be is maybe more of a habit and a pattern. And it's confined within what's comfortable, and to step outside makes me anxious. I try to do work when I do psychotherapy as a sex therapist, where we look at people's arousal template, which looks at their fantasy and what they engage in with pornography, to try to understand other parts of themselves. And we start to ask questions as to, why do you have the sex you have? What would it mean, or what would it feel like to challenge some of those identities? So I have them start to look at those identities, right? Who are you as a sexual being? What part of you is drawn to that? What would it mean to step outside of that? Practicing stepping outside of that. So it's a lot of that like internal work and questioning, and sometimes it's very experiential. What I like about porn, when used correctly, is that it can be a space to practice, where you don't have to step outside your home or own what it is you're stepping into, but it's a way to explore and see how that feels. Also works that way for couples. I work with some couples that want to maybe think about bringing in another partner, or they like the idea of it but don't like the idea of it, and porn's a way to practice seeing your partner turned on by something other than you, or to bring another in symbolically. So porn can can play a role in that. But again, it really goes back to asking yourself, who do I see myself to be? And to find some areas to push on those boundaries, push on those edges. So talking about mindful uses of porn and how you're using it as almost like a prescription in these cases, that's going to sound crazy to some people, because they think it's only degrading and it's only harmful. So what would you say to someone that says porn ruins more marriages and families than helps? Would you say that that's true? Or I would go back to what we said earlier, which is, don't blame what people try to use as a solution. Don't blame that and scapegoat that as though that is the problem, right? And what I mean is, in a lot of the couples I've worked with, if the relationship is feeling good and the sex is feeling good, they don't necessarily feel the need to choose porn over their partner, or they can at least talk to their partner about why they're making that decision, right? And bring their partner into that dialogue. And then that also becomes diagnostic. If you can't talk about that as a couple, well, we have some work to do. I want you to be able to talk about really vulnerable, deeper topics, and that's a way to start that work. So I don't want to blame what people, again, choose as the solution. And again, porn is such an easy scapegoat. And and I see that the way I see drugs and alcohol and overuse of the gym and shopping, is it's a way people try to cope with wounds and dysregulation, and often an inability to honestly talk to their partner or whomever about what needs to really be processed and discussed.
One of the things that I loved that you said yesterday, you were talking about sexual maturity, and is your partner sexually mature enough to present them with certain information? I was like, whoa, that's amazing. This is always shocking when I say, or someone hears it for the first time. I was a toxic monogamous. Like, my level of jealousy was just, it was what was modeled for me. So I have a mom that's borderline, and like that was really difficult. And then the romantic relationships that were modeled for me were very tumultuous, and I just thought that that's how we behave, and that everything was a threat to what was mine, right? So again, then there's this element of possessiveness,
and that capitalist ownership.
Yes, which I would love to get into. So it's like, you have someone and they want to bring someone in and like share this, like, yes, I want to watch porn, and their partner's not allowing them to, or they don't feel that it'll be received well. Would you have couples that come in, and then do you help facilitate that ask?
Yeah, sexual maturity and sexual safety is a really important concept. And I think people think about it only in terms of sexual abuse and sexual assault. But I think we have to look at it in terms of just our ability to bear our vulnerable, honest, authentic self to our primary partner. And are they mature enough and safe enough to have that brought to them? And how aware are we of how they manage their own anxiety and conflict? And if a couple presents as though they're not stable enough or loving enough or securely attached enough to deal with the anxiety that can come up when your partner says, I also enjoy body shapes and sizes that aren't yours, which can be very threatening to someone who's toxically monogamous.
I always thought you can only be attracted to one type of person.
Isn't that wild now when you look back?
They look different than me in any way. I must be disgusting to you, and you no longer love me or attracted to me.
A lot of people relate to that. And I remind them that not only is that not true, but with eyes and whatnot, we're going to be oriented towards a lot of different things.
Of course.
And we want to really honor the gift that is someone who we love saying, I want to bring you into these deeper parts of who I am. What a beautiful sign.
Beautiful.
Right? Really
like,
beautiful.
Play with me.
Play with me.
Yes.
And then I trust that they'll be able to talk about other non-sexual high anxiety inducing things, right? Because that's part of the lifespan. Talking to your partner about financial stress and issues. I work with couples that will drop a bomb. I want another baby. I don't want the baby we talked about maybe having. And being able to talk about these deeper parts of our sexuality is a way to practice and working up towards some of that. So again, I want couples to assess their own maturity as well. Am I mature enough for my partner to come to me, just as much as I want them to assess as my partner mature enough for me to go to?
Don't say you want honesty if you're not going to offer a safe place for them to come to you, because
100%.
The first time, it will be the last time if they come to you in radical honesty and you punish them for that. So don't punish behavior you want repeated.
That's right. And say thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for coming to me honestly and telling me this part of yourself. It makes me anxious. That was very hard to hear, but thank you for telling me. Let me process and sit with what came up for me, but always just say thank you for bearing that part of yourself with me.
Beautiful. I couldn't agree more. And then they'll be like, what? Now, why are you lying? Well, you punish them. So now that you just taught them how to behave in this situation. I'm curious, do you have any... have you seen clients where you see a big discrepancy between jealousy with hetero and gay couples? Because Esther Perel does this bit where she talks about specifically pornography or any kind of open or poly relationship, where in hetero couples, like the women tend to have a higher jealousy rate, especially when it comes to seeing porn as cheating, whereas the gay community, it's like what is considered cheating is very different.
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah, I definitely see that. Me and Esther see this topic a little differently. We see that similarly. She does sometimes define some of that as cheating, porn use, and some of that, but sticking to the topic in your question, the gay community is a community where defined roles weren't set for them and they had to figure everything out on their own. And so they don't have rigid gendered or sexual orientation expectations inherently set. Right? So when you're part of an identity or community where there's not a lot of norms or expectations, you figure it out and you're more open and you're more authentic, where heterosexuality definitely has a lot of expectations, such as we're going to date, we're going to become monogamous, we're going to get married, we're going to have kids, we're going to buy a house together. Gay community does not have that. It's only up until recently, as you said, that there's even the ability or expectation that marriage could happen. So there's more freedom and there's more room. And I think being part of an identity that's marginalized and exploited, you inherently have more vulnerability and more community. And there's just different norms from that.
Yeah, that tracks. I guess I always get confused. And again, it's weird that I'm confused because I would have been one of those women. But there's this evolutionary biological explanation for why women get jealous. And it tends to be like a lack of resources, which means I'm not going to survive as well. So women tend to get more jealous if a man has a potential of falling in love versus if it's just like a one-off. And then the man tends to get jealous if there's a risk of getting pregnant. Yeah. But if that's true, or if that's mostly true, then he's not going to fall in love with a woman that he's probably never going to meet. So I find it interesting, like the level of jealousy and how it is so staunchly seen as cheating, and like the women have like this visceral response when he's never going to see her. Yeah. So it tends to, I see it as going against that that evolutionary biology argument.
And thankfully, and what evolutionary biology often forgets or leaves out is that we have the ability to learn and to change our thoughts and to grow and to challenge ourselves and to challenge what might have been evolutionary needs that no longer are valid, right? I mean, tell me a little bit about how you came to undo your toxic monogamy.
Oh my goodness. So honestly, it's so funny because people have this idea that porn automatically is going to ruin relationships and it's just awful for you, and there's no way that you can have any kind of like spiritual or personal development in it. It is the thing that has changed me the most in such a beautiful way. It has challenged every sense of identity that I've ever had, every sense of relationship, what love is, what ownership is, what freedom is, all of these really fundamental things. And I think because I did it in the public eye and it was so heavily scrutinized, I had no choice but to really look at it and have answers for myself, and then constantly be evolving because the world demands that you evolve. You can't just be this one thing forever. But when I started to see couples that were in porn, like legacy porn stars, and they were in these deep committed relationships, and that was shocking to me. And I remember I was getting ready to do my first boy girl, hadn't done it yet, and I'm at this convention. I'm so nervous because it's in a couple of days, and this woman runs up to me and she's so happy, and she's like, I heard Mick is gonna do your first scene. This is her husband, and I'm so happy for you. He is such a gentleman. Please let him know if you need anything, he will take care of you. And she was like happy for me because she just knew what a great man her husband was. And I was like, this is so weird.
It is so countercultural.
Like, why is she not trying to fight me right now? Right. And then I do the scene and I'm shaking like a leaf. I'm so nervous. I had not been with many men in my personal life, so this was like a huge jump for me. And he pulled me aside and he's like, if at any point you're uncomfortable, let me know. Squeeze my leg. How
healing, though.
I'll talk to the director.
On so many levels.
I'll be your conduit. Wow. And I was like, I've never had a man care about me this much before or during sex in my civilian life. And now I'm in this thing that everyone says is evil and bad. And like, this is the most cared for I've ever been. So it just really took all of my beliefs and flipped them upside down.
And what's hard for me to hear is that most likely outside of that industry, you can't expect to find a lot of men that think and talk like that to a woman engaging in sex with them.
No.
Right?
Right.
And that's what I think is really interesting, is that the sex workers I know and have dated and work with clinically, there's so much growth that can come from that. And the bar is often higher because of the communication and the
stakes are higher too. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they have to be.
It's really beautiful. So for you, that was that transformative piece.
Yeah, it was massive. Wow. And I just saw all kinds of relationships, and like, it can be a different way. And the way that I've been approaching it hasn't been serving me. It's not what I want. It's kind of just what I've been modeled to do. And wait, I do have a choice. And it wasn't easy. There was a ton of jealousy. There was a lot of growing pains, but then that forced a ton of communication. And then it's how fragile do I want my relationship to be? Do I want it as simple as he double clicks a bikini pic on Instagram and our relationship is over? That's, for some people, that's a real thing.
Thank you for saying that word. How fragile do I want my relationship to be? Do I want to create something that's robust and we can talk through what comes up, or do I want to be threatened by someone's finger double tapping an image of someone who my partner will never actually see or engage or talk to in the world?
Right.
Right? And relationships will end over that, because some people's definition of cheating is that.
Absolutely.
Just that. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I guess one of the things too that I love so much is the idea of compersion. So it's this idea of truly, and to me that's love. Like it's I want you happy even if it's not with me. Like, because I love you so much. It has nothing to do with me.
Sometimes to my actual detriment even.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
I agree with you. What an evolved, mature definition of love. That I care about you, as you just said, not to take
No,
away from you,
please.
that I place you before me sometimes.
Yeah. And I think so much it's taking, like what you see with relationships is just this thing that they call love, but really it's only love under a very strict amount of conditions.
Yes.
Like unconditional love is almost non-existent.
There's this old school psychoanalytic concept called cathexis, and it's the opposite of love, but it's what most people see to be love. And cathexis in shorthand says it's about how you relate to something and you love it to the limits of your comfort. And once it challenges you or you're forced to grow, you cut it off. And I kind of use the example, and this isn't 100% accurate, but people will do that with their pets, right? And I say this lovingly. People say, I love my pet, but we still want them to not go on certain furniture, and we don't want them to grow and develop. We want them to do and to stay within our comfort zone. That isn't the true definition of love. It's what you just said. And a lot of people confuse cathecting with love. Love is us being forced to go up against ourselves and to grow.
Yeah, and then that segues into, how do you say it? It's like that, the capitalistic model of love?
Yeah, so I was talking yesterday at the Shaw conference about different negative discourses around sexuality, and one of them being a capitalist model, which is once you're my partner, or we have a label of boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, or wife, that I now own you. I own your body, I own your sexuality, and how traumatizing and traumatic that is, and how we very much have to challenge that because it's very normal for people to see it that way. We even use the languaging. That's my wife. It's not your wife. That my is that word of ownership. And some people take that too far, thinking that I get to weigh in on what your eyeballs do, and I can decide what kind of porn you're looking at. And I kind of said yesterday, if I'm alone at home, I get to decide what I eat. I get to decide what music I'm listening to. I get to decide when I'm home alone what movies I'm watching. I get to decide when I'm home alone, well, anytime actually, what I do with my body. Monogamy is about my relationship to other people. But some people see relationality as I own you and your body, even when it doesn't involve someone else. And I can be upset if you're masturbating. I can be upset at what you're looking at, and that's problematic.
I think it's abusive. I think for the women that this, correct me if I'm wrong, because you have had so many patients, but just what I've seen is the scale tips in favor of women as far as controlling the body and what the guy is watching, listening to, and whether or not he's, quote, allowed to masturbate, and that's abusive. Yes. If you were to do that to a woman, like just flip the sexes right there, and then you would say, that's not okay. He's telling you what you can watch. That is abusive. So why are we letting women do it? And I think there's this almost like a resistance for a man to like stand up for himself and say, no, this is my body. And this isn't a threat. Like, look for threats to our relationship. Have I shown you any signs that I'm going to leave you, be unfaithful, break whatever agreements we have? No. So you have to challenge your own inner dialogue, and like this is a saboteur in this moment, right? It's tricking you.
Because if you trust me, trust me. And if you don't, let's talk about the fact that you don't.
Yes.
Because if you do, then I should be able to go wherever I go with whomever I go there with. It shouldn't matter what I'm up to when I'm out with my friends. Because if you trust me, you know I'm looking out for you in our relationship, even when you're not there. And not to like segue the conversation, but there's actually another application of this, which is when we talk about a lot of sexual dysfunctions, I also want men to say, I have a right to the way my penis functions. I'm not going to let someone tell me that I have erectile issues, erections come and go. I have a right to my body as it is. This is what I'm offering you. And same thing with men commenting on women's bodies and weight gain or weight loss or whatever it is. That's also abusive. Women have a right to the body they have, men have a right to the body they have, and we also have to not apply it in that way. Yeah,
and there are so many stories that I've been told where like a man feels safe enough to tell me where he would have an experience, and maybe even a formative sexual experience with a woman, and then she would emasculate him because he was too quick or he couldn't get hard, and how that creates a trauma that really lasts with him, and then that makes it really hard for him to get vulnerable with future partners. And again, I think it's women get away with a lot more because it's not like an immediate violent attack. It's a lot more subtle, and again, I consider that abusive. I don't think that's okay at all. So you shouldn't, again, and even if it's not a long-term committed relationship, you should be committed in that moment. Let's say you just met 2 hours ago, that, like you say, like they're a real person, they have real feelings, and empathize with that and be like, oh, that's fine, that happens, that's natural, there's nothing wrong with you.
And I think that should be a general expectation that you have on anyone who enters your world in any way, as a client, as a friend, as a lover, as a partner, as a hookup, that that we're going to recognize each other's humanity, and we're going to realize that any interpersonal relation, any personal interaction on any level is not neutral. And we leave people feeling better off in their bodies in the world with other people or worse off. And if you're commenting negatively on someone's body and how it functions or their penis size or anything, you're harming them. And that's going to impact how they move forward with someone else. Because we still very much normalize making small dick jokes.
Yeah.
And people saying when I'm dating no one who, I only want someone who's hung and all that. That's a form of sexual trauma and body trauma. And I'm working with a lot of individuals that are working on feeling okay in the world in their body with a smaller penis or a larger size body or whatever it might be.
Were you ever in a position in your life where you did see people as like ownership, like you had kind of a possessive relationship?
Really good question. I think I can honestly say no.
Wow.
And so maybe the deeper question is like, how did that come to be then, right? Because our culture doesn't set you up to think that way. And I guess this is further in my life, so it still doesn't really answer the question, but there was a time in my life where I was dating people that were in the sex work industry, and I had a lot of friends that were, and they came into my life, I guess, at a really beautiful time where it helped me understand and back away from that. I just never really had an anxious attachment style. I never really had a lot of toxic monogamy ideals. Did my mom and dad in their relationship impact that? I don't know how it would have. They were pretty normal. There wasn't really much in that. I somehow at early ages really found a lot of feminist literature. I was always a radical. When I was young, I was this like punk rock kid getting tattooed at 16. And instead of going in maybe a negative direction, I found just really free thinking, healthy people in those worlds. And they really instilled in me just really beautiful ethics and concepts. And so I was really blessed to have found these marginalized people that from the outset were scary. They're tattooed, they have crazy hairstyles and piercings. But we were just like really healthy people that had great ethics, and we honored all the diverse ways that people could exist. And it influenced me very positively.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
I'm so
You're
thankful.
Definitely a rare bird.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. I want to get into hookup culture.
Sure.
So it goes back to the pendulum overcorrecting. And what are your thoughts on kind of like the Louise Perry perspective that hookup culture is destroying young women?
Hookup culture is complicated, and I have really complicated thoughts on it because I want to, on one level, validate it because I'm a fan of sexual relational developmental milestones, and I want people to be around a lot of different kinds of people and learn about boundaries and consent and communication and what feels good and all of that. But I also think there's a lot of really toxic norms within that world, and so when someone's a participant in hookup culture, my first honest response is, and I feel that way when people are dating on the apps. I think they're valuable. I think they're great, but I'm also like, oh man, you got a lot ahead of you because people don't have a lot of sexual ethics. They don't have a lot of relational ethics. And as a general psychotherapist as well, because my original training's in clinical psychology and clinical mental health, I want people to, again, take more seriously both how they impact everyone, because I think that's a concept of mental health. We care about how we impact people. But I also want people to have a value system, which sounds a little outside of mental health.
You can't have values and be in hookup culture. What are you talking
right?
about?
And I feel that to be true sometimes. Yeah. And I think it's really interesting where if you ask people a lot of questions like, what are your financial goals? What are your career goals? They have answers. But if you say to them, what are your ethics and values? What is your decision-making metrics when you're up against a decision that you can't make? And a lot of people don't know what ethics or values drive them. And I think that's part of what we see in hookup culture is people don't have a metric. And I think we need to, and I think they should. I think it should be applied there and elsewhere. So I think it's a deeper issue of culturally we don't value that kind of talk or thinking. And hookup culture, it shows up in there powerfully.
Yeah, what I've seen in porn, and then what I also see with just the regular civilian population, specifically with younger women, there's this really pervasive internal dishonesty that they have with themselves. And porn, I think it can be so damaging because the internet is forever, and the acts are a lot more extreme than what you're gonna find, at a bar and with a regular civilian guy, right? Like there's some girls that do acts that are just not good for your body, and it's almost like who can be the most extreme or like the dirtiest slut, because in some way that's commendable in that industry. So it gives you a level of prestige. Like I'm the dirtiest, I'm the most extreme, I'm the baddest, I have no limits. And to me, I think that's so dangerous. I imagine
sometimes they cloak it under, I'm actually super sex positive.
Right.
So then it's healthy.
Can't shame me.
That's right.
And then I've had people say this and they're like, you can't shame this whore. And I'm like, and it's funny, but in such a sad way, because I would call out this behavior because some of it would be unsafe. It's like, if you're going to go out there and sleep with all of these people untested and come back to the industry, like, fuck you, because you're putting other people's health at risk. You can't do that.
And the partners of those partners, the partners of your scene partners.
Right. And so many of them are married or in some kind of mostly monogamous relationships, which is pretty shocking.
When I dated a sex worker, I had to trust that all of that was happening, so that when my partner came home and we were intimate, I had to trust that I was being protected.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's a level of just recklessness that I just couldn't get behind. And to me, it's a trauma response. And then more often than not, years after people would get out, they would just have this revelation, like, man, I really didn't want to do those scenes. And how awful, because some of them, again, are really traumatizing, like really, really traumatizing. So have you worked with helping people kind of take off these masks or these shells that they've convinced themselves that they are, to help them establish healthy boundaries? Because I know porn is an outlying example, but a lot of people are participating in hookup culture. And if they don't have a strong ethos, or these are my boundaries before they participate, they're going to get hurt.
Yeah. Wow, so much in what you just said. That was really powerful. Do I work with people in and out in those ways? Yeah, there's this concept in clinical psychology called differentiation, and it's someone's ability to, in the face of this other, set boundaries and not have a reflected sense of worth, not people please, not try to be approved. And even though some of those individuals on the surface seem like they're very differentiated because they're saying no one's going to shame me, in fact, it's very much driven by an attempt to get approval and to get a reflected back sense of worth, because I'm the baddest of them all. I'm the dirtiest, right? And so it's really about getting deeper and starting to define it as such. And I think that's important work for all of us, because, again, as I said earlier, most people move through the world conformist, doing what everyone else is doing, or authoritarian. I'm doing what I think I'm supposed to do. And I think mental health is about stepping outside of that, understanding what our boundaries are and our limits are, stepping into our anxiety and setting those boundaries when needed, looking at impact in the short term and in the long term. And I think that shifts and has an impact in diverse ways, especially for people in the industry. Because as you said, that lives forever. There's no taking some of that stuff back. And even if you could, what's the internal ongoing impact that you have on looking back at having done some of those things?
Yeah. And that's why, I mean, I'm a big proponent of raising the age of entry for film. I think it should be 25. And I know
What
that
is it
sounds
now?
18.
18's a very young, I mean, it's such a cliche, but it's true. Your brain and your, neofrontal cortex and all of that, your judgment, all that isn't fully online until around 24, 25.
And men, they're saying now 30.
I believe that. And so at 18, to be tasked with making decisions that you can't take back, I think is an unfair pressure to maybe put on someone. I mean, you can't even drink alcohol at 18.
Or get cigarettes now.
Yeah, right?
Cigarettes are 21.
Do you get pushback when people hear you say that about raising the age?
Because they use their story and they're fine, and I would challenge a lot of them, like, are you really? And because there's a lot of like user bias, like you're like looking for ways that your decision was right.
Okay.
I've got in a little bit later. I think I was 21, which was still young, and it's at that age you are so easily influenced by fame and money and power and prestige and like all of these things that I don't think that you can make an honest decision with a lot of things, because all these influences are so heavy. And then you're also put in situations where you might be the only female and there's 20 other people on set, and I, as like a very disagreeable, strong woman, have been put in situations that were really hard for me, but I like held my ground. But that I saw all these other women not be able to do it, and they'd be like, well, if you don't do this act exactly this way, or if you don't make this face, or if you don't sleep with all of these guys, it was only supposed to be one, but now there's 3, crew doesn't get paid. And then they put that pressure, and like, that's a lot for an 18-year-old.
Sure.
A lot.
Yeah.
Especially when it's all men, you know?
Yeah, because someone at 18 is not, as I was saying earlier, differentiated, able to go up against and not people please and not perform for this imaginary audience and all that. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting concept. You have my support.
Yeah, I don't know how that changes, but yeah.
And even for those that maybe did enter at a younger age and didn't have a negative impact, that doesn't mean that that's going to be true for everyone.
Exactly, right? And you can't just use your story as like, this is the model for everybody. And yeah, I think it needs to be more of like an honest conversation. But it's hard because one of the things you were saying in your talk was that for up until recently, you wouldn't really criticize porn. I'm glad that you do now, because my perspective is that if you're in a highly criticized industry, that it's almost your duty to be radically honest and like hold bad actors accountable, because what the public sees is if you don't acknowledge it from the inside, that you're not a reliable source anymore, and that you're trying to also participate in the cover up of all of these problems.
Well said. And that probably was how I was perceived at times. Because for those that are, listening, I was saying that for many, many years, I was unwilling to talk about the negatives of porn because I felt like that's all that was talked about. And that's what everyone was already doing. There's so much of that out there. And I really wanted to be one of those people that was focusing on some of the positives and the clinical uses of it. And then I realized, I guess you said it so beautifully, that actually discredits me, because everything has a dark side. Everything has a shadow side. It does. And we have to be able to look at all of it. We have to critically analyze everything, especially those on the inside. And that's why this weekend, and as I move forward, and hopefully in my next book, I'll start to talk about that. And I think that's important. Yeah.
What's your next book on?
So my first book, Sex Outside the Lines, was, I thought that might be my one and only book. You never know what's to come in your career, right? And so I felt so blessed to get this opportunity. I'd done a TV show, I got a book deal, and I wanted to be hyper academic, and I wanted to put every thought I ever had in this book, right? And you can't do that. And so it was like a little all over the place, super smart, really proud of it. My next book, Rebel Love, they wanted it to be a little more user-friendly, a little more simplistic, and really hitting all the cultural stuff that we're talking about. I want my next book to be hyper clinical. I want it to be everything I talked about this weekend, everything we're talking about right now, just very clinically driven, very conceptual, basically what we're talking about now and what I talked about this weekend. That's what the book is going to be. And
are you still seeing patients?
I am. Yeah, it's my primary job right now. I historically was doing a lot of media, had a couple TV shows, did a lot of work with Amber Rose. Me and her took over Dr. Drew's podcast. We were doing it as a podcast. I was on her VH1 show. I was guest hosting on the doctor's daytime show. I had my own radio show. I was doing all that, writing. And right now, took a little break. I got tired. I got burnt out. I was traveling too much. And right now, it's mainly my clinical practice and working with the Sexual Health Alliance as their director of education and putting together programming in the conference. And just really doing more clinical academic work, which is a really important part of what I enjoy. I love that smart stuff, but I miss media. I hope to get back into it soon.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, we'll keep an eye on all of that. Do you want to tell the listeners, watchers, how they can support you, where they can follow you, all that good stuff?
Yeah, so mostly I'm more Instagram at Dr. Donahue. I don't really use Twitter much, but that's at Chris Donahue. My website, drchrisdonahue.com, is where you can reach me if you want to do clinical work. And my books, Sex Outside the Lines and Rebel Love, are found everywhere.
Amazing. Thank you so much. This was a pleasure.
So great to sit with you. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.